The adrenal glands sit atop each kidney, composed of an inner layer, the adrenal medulla, and an outer layer, the adrenal cortex. The structure and function of the hormones produced in both are different. However, all the hormones are released in response to stress. In the short-term response to stress in a fight-or-flight situation, the nerves of the sympathetic nervous system stimulates the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine and norepinephrine, two similar hormones. The nervous system works faster than the metabolism of pituitary tropic hormones for a more immediate response. Epinephrine is a potent hormone to stimulate the cardiovascular system. Pupils dilate to receive more visual information, and blood is shunted away from the digestive system to the musculoskeletal system, and glycogen is converted to glucose, a ready source of energy. This is why epinephrine is the medication of choice in cases of cardiac arrest or anaphylactic shock. Norepinephrine's role is the regulation of blood pressure. In the long-term response to stress, the adrenal cortex, in response to anterior pituitary tropic hormones, known collectively as ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormones, release steroid hormones. Glucocorticoids are a collection of hormones that increase blood glucose levels. Cortisol is the most abundant glucocorticoid and often works in conjunction with epinephrine. Cortisol converts non-carbohydrate substrates like protein from muscles and fat from adipose tissue into glucose. Too much cortisol in the blood triggers a negative feedback response, shutting down the hypothalamus and pituitary. Aldosterone is the main mineralocorticoid. You learned about this one in Biology 20 when you did the excretory system. It increases the reabsorption of sodium in the kidneys, shifting the concentration gradient, causing water to come out of the nephron, thus reducing urine volume while increasing blood volume and raising blood pressure. Some sex hormones are released here, but we'll talk about that in another unit. In the adrenal medulla, hormones are released as a short-term response to a fight-or-flight stress. They are short-term and fast-acting. Fast-acting because the response is mediated by the nerves of the sympathetic nervous system, which initiates hormone release faster than if tropic hormones from the pituitary were used. Epinephrine, cardiovascular stimulation, vascular dilation of the skeletal muscles, conversion of glycogen to glucose. Epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, the same stuff used in EpiPens to stimulate the heart and airway passages of the lungs when someone suffers an allergic reaction. A very potent hormone that is also a neurotransmitter in some nerves of the nervous system. Norepinephrine regulates blood pressure, also known as noradrenaline. Released in lesser amounts, it is an important part of the stress response. The adrenal cortex produces hormones that act in the long-term response to stress. If the body needs to maintain a state of readiness, the adrenal cortex has hormones that keeps the body in a preparatory response mode. The adrenal cortex produces hormones released in response to ACTH from the anterior pituitary. The hypothalamus, in response to the central nervous system, sends hypothalamic releasing hormones to the anterior pituitary via the portal system. The pituitary releases the tropic hormone ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which targets the adrenal cortex. Once enough adrenal cortex hormones are detected in the blood, the negative feedback system shuts off HRH and ACTH production. Glucocorticoids are a family of similar acting hormones of which cortisol is the most abundant member. Cortisol, working with epinephrine, liberates amino acids from muscle protein and adds them to the circulatory system. The liver takes them up and converts them to glucose, thereby increasing the blood glucose concentration. Cortisol also converts fat stored in adipose tissue into fatty acids, which are then further converted for the body to use as an energy source. Cortisol is used medically as an anti-inflammatory. The body responds to infection by inflammation, in which the cells of the immune system attack foreign invaders. So sustained use of medical cortisol can make a person susceptible to infection. The most important mineralocorticoid is aldosterone. Released in response to blood pressure receptors, aldosterone causes the kidneys to reabsorb more sodium. This changes the osmotic concentrations on either side of the nephron, causing water to be reabsorbed back into the body instead of lost in the urine. This reabsorption increases blood volume and thus blood pressure. Pancreatic hormones. Because the pancreas mostly contains cells that make digestive enzymes that travel by way of the pancreatic duct to the small intestine, it is more of an exocrine gland than an endocrine gland. Scattered throughout are about 2,000 groups of endocrine cells called islets of Langerhans. Two types of cells found in these clusters are named alpha cells, which produce the hormone glucagon, and beta cells, which produce the hormone insulin. These oppositely acting hormones regulate blood sugar and are released when pancreatic cells detect changes in blood glucose concentrations. Like the parathyroid glands, they respond to changes in blood chemistry. Since they have opposite actions, glucagon and insulin are antagonistic hormones. When blood glucose levels are high after a meal, the beta cells release insulin into the blood. Insulin allows the active transport of glucose into the body's cells. Usually there's more glucose than the cells need at that moment, so insulin also converts excess glucose into the body's storage form of energy, glycogen, and stores it in the liver and muscles. The glycogen in muscle cells facilitate the synthesis of protein. Sometimes there's a lot more glucose than we find a space for, even for as glycogen. The body doesn't waste this extra energy source and converts it to efficient packaging format as fat, storing it in adipose tissue. Fat has many times more energy per kilogram than glucose. When blood sugar levels are low after exercising or a period of fasting, the alpha cells secrete glucagon. Glucagon makes more glucose available for cells by converting glycogen in the liver and muscle cells to glucose, and being a part of the biochemical pathway that converts fat from adipose tissue to a glucose-like energy source. In combination with other hormones, glucagon converts proteins into glucose. These conversion processes all occur at the same time, but if glycogen stores are plentiful, fat conversion is lessened and protein conversion is minimized. The body's response to low-carbohydrate diets has been drawn into sharp focus over the past few decades. The exocrine tissue secretes digestive enzymes in the pancreatic duct, which channels into the small intestine. The endocrine tissue of the pancreas secretes the hormone directly into the bloodstream and targets almost every cell in the body, because almost every cell in the body has insulin receptors. The beta cells are one of two cell types of the islets of Langerhans and produce insulin. Pancreatic receptors detect a high concentration of glucose and then release insulin. The release of insulin is mediated by changes in blood chemistry rather than as a tropic hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. Nearly all cells in the body have insulin receptor sites, and once insulin is bound to these sites, the glucose can be actively transported into the cells. Additionally, insulin is responsible for the conversion of glucose to glycogen, the body's storage form of glucose. Glycogen reserves are found in the liver and muscles. Excess glucose is converted to fat, and the fat is stored in adipose tissue. Fat is an efficient storage form of energy. In some parts of the body, adipose tissue is essential as an immediate source of energy and also to provide cushioning protection for some organs, like the kidneys, for example. Once glucose levels drop, less glucose is attached to the pancreatic receptors and insulin secretions stop. The other type of cell in the islets of Langerhans produce glucagon. Insulin and glucagon are antagonistic hormones. They have opposite functions. If, after exercise or a long period of fasting, glucose levels in the blood drop, the lack of glucose attached to the pancreatic receptors releases glucagon, which goes about making more glucose available. It does this by converting the glycogen stores back into glucose, fatty acids from fat, and glucose from muscle protein. If all this sounds familiar, epinephrine and cortisol from the adrenal glands, then it's not surprising that all this conversion goes on under the control of multiple hormones. If the ability to produce enough insulin was a genetic issue, it would become apparent early on in life. Type 1 diabetes mellitus, or juvenile diabetes, is a condition in which your immune system would target and destroy the insulin-producing beta cells of the pancreas. Before insulin was identified as the hormone involved, this disease would cause kids to literally starve to death because the key to putting sugar into their cells was missing. Once insulin was discovered by Canadian Frederick Banting at the University of Toronto in 1921, insulin was harvested from cadavers and, while working at the University of Alberta, injected into the first kid, a diabetic boy like the one shown here. Almost immediately, their symptoms disappeared. Insulin from cadavers had to stop for the same reason harvesting HGH from cadavers had to stop. Whatever virus or bacteria that killed the cadaver would have been passed on to the diabetic, so cow and pig insulin was used for decades after. Apart from some side effects some people suffered because it turns out that cow and pig insulin isn't exactly the same as human insulin, it went well until synthetic human insulin was developed by a brand new technology, DNA recombination. Insulin was the first human protein to be grown in bacteria and sold as a therapy. Now, Dr. James Shapiro pioneered the first islet cell transplant, called the Edmonton Protocol, right here at the University of Alberta. Donor islet cells have been successfully transplanted in the liver of a diabetic, who now doesn't even need insulin injections. Diabetes mellitus is characterized by frequent urination and loss of glucose in the urine. Honey-sweet urine is the more literal translation of the Greek diabetes mellitus. Remember, diabetes is not necessarily an insulin issue. Recall diabetes insipidus. When insulin is not responding to the increase in glucose in the blood, there is no mechanism to feed the cells. The glucose concentration becomes high enough to push its way through the glomerulus of the nephrons in the kidneys, causing damage, and the glucose appears in the urine. The glucose can form crystals in the blood, which can damage the fine and delicate capillary networks of the body. If this occurs in the eye, it will cause blindness, North America's leading cause of blindness. Some people have an inability to properly regulate the amount of insulin released. It can be released in response to a drop in blood glucose, making the situation worse. This is a life-threatening condition, which is why if a person presents with the symptoms of an insulin reaction, give sugar. If they need the sugar, the results will be immediate and life-saving. If it turns out you misdiagnosed and they already have too much sugar, giving more sugar isn't going to make too much of a difference. There are two classifications of diabetes, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is an autoimmune disorder and is usually identified early in life. Your immune system makes antibodies that target and destroy the beta cells of the pancreas, preventing the normal production and release of insulin. Insulin injections, while inconvenient, prevents the slow death it once did before the 1920s. Because it's identified in kids, it's also called juvenile onset diabetes. With type 2 diabetes, if you don't produce enough insulin receptors because they damage and need replacing, the lack of response to these receptors or the drop in number of these receptors produce diabetes-like symptoms. Generally controlled through diet, type 2 diabetics don't require insulin injections because, for the most part, insulin production is not the problem. The insulin receptors are protein, and there is a gene that codes for this specific protein. If the gene is mutated, or more commonly, if you only have one copy of a functioning gene, you should actually have two, one from each parent, then the receptor production is going to be strained. If you have a lifestyle that includes a lot of carbohydrates in your diet, then there's an extra strain on this receptor. This is why this condition can be controlled by diet and is found on older people. Here's a list of